Welcome to this edition of Head to Head. I'm your host, Cam McKinney, and this is episode number 274 of the podcast. And on this episode, I'm talking about the likely retirement of starting pitcher Stephen Strasburg. On June 8, 2010, starting pitcher Stephen Strasburg threw a debut outing for the ages, going 7 strong innings and striking out 14 batters against the Pittsburgh Pirates. We all felt like we were watching the next great starting pitcher. Fast forward to today, and Strasburg is likely retiring due to multiple injury issues, the very same thing the Nationals were trying to protect him from. He isn't going to end up in the Hall of Fame like many thought he would, but Strasburg had a memorable pitching career, going 113-62. He won double-digit games 7 times with a career 3.24 earned run average. He struck out at least 190 batters 5 times in his career, leading the National League in 2014 with 242 strikeouts. His career high was in 2019 with 252 strikeouts. He's a 3-time All-Star. In 2019, he led the National League with 18 wins, and that postseason helped the Washington Nationals win the World Series, winning World Series MVP. People were talking about Strasburg before he pitched in the big leagues. They were talking about his collegiate career. College baseball isn't nearly as popular or as big as college football or basketball. Strasburg was on a national radar. His coach in college was none other than the late, great Tony Gwynn. And there's rightfully a lot of sadness about this story. I think people feel like Strasburg's career is a sad one, and it is. He didn't live up to the hype because of injury. He didn't pitch as long as we all thought he was going to. But I do believe this is also a major loss for the sport of baseball, because Stephen Strasburg is a big name. He was a phenom. He was somebody who was going to be and was a star pitcher. And I think there are very few star starting pitchers nowadays. With everything that's going on with openers, I feel like starters are just not as big as they used to be. I mean, the league used to be filled with so many star pitchers. At one point, you had Pedro Martinez, you had Tom Glavine, you had John Smoltz, you had Greg Maddux, you had Randy Johnson, Curt Schilling, Mike Mussina. The league was filled with so many aces. How many true aces are there in Major League Baseball today? There are a lot of very good starting pitchers, but how many are big name stars? The guys I'm thinking are older pitchers like Justin Verlander, Max Scherzer, Jacob deGrom, Clayton Kershaw, Garrett Cole. They are established pitchers. I feel like the sport is not developing young starting pitchers and turning them into stars the way they did with a guy like Stephen Strasburg. I just feel like I look at him and I go, there may never be another guy as big as Stephen Strasburg was who comes into the league and dominates right away. He's somebody we all knew was coming and we were all excited about. And that was something that was common back in baseball. I mean, you had a guy like Dwight Gooden who comes so young to the Mets and everyone's hyped about him, and he lives up to that hype. It just kind of dawned on me with Strasburg retiring that it feels like not only the end of a playing career, but the end of an era where you would have a young pitcher like that everyone was talking about and making a big deal of before he ever threw a major league pitch. I mean, there is no equivalent in today in the sport of baseball. There is no new guy who feels like Stephen Strasburg. Yes, you have young pitchers like Sean Strider doing very well with the Atlanta Braves, but there wasn't a ton of hype around him. I'm a Red Sox fan and they have Brian Bayo, but the hype wasn't on a national level. I mean, everyone who was a fan of the sport of baseball, and even if you weren't, was hearing about the name Stephen Strasburg, and that's something that is missing in the sport today, the hype around young starting pitchers. And I think it's the sport's own fault why we don't have that hype, because young pitchers are asked to do so little nowadays. They don't throw 150 to 200 innings. They don't get to pitch in the postseason because they're usually being held back by the team, and they certainly don't make 32 starts. And as we all know, they don't throw 100 pitches a game anymore. Guys guys go 5 and then they're done. They don't get to become workhorses the way that they used to, and I think that's part of what was a detriment to Stephen Strasburg, but also a thing that turned him into a star in the first place. 14 strikeouts in his major league debut. A young pitcher would never even throw that many pitches in today's game. And if you follow the sport of baseball, then you remember the early days of Strasburg's career were dominated by talk about how the Nationals were managing his workload. After coming back from Tommy John surgery, the team shut down Strasburg in 2012, where he went 15-6 and did not allow him to pitch during the postseason. Did the Washington Nationals do the team wrong by doing this? Probably, absolutely. They messed up their chance to win the World Series, and I think the thing that hurts the most is it really didn't help him in the long term because Strasburg did not have a long career in the major leagues. This is getting off topic a bit, but I feel like one of my main concerns about the sport of baseball right now is what is going to happen with the starting pitcher position, and I think this does relate to Stephen Strasburg because he's not going to make the Hall of Fame, but he had a real impact on the sport of baseball. And the reason he's not going to make the Baseball Hall of Fame is because he doesn't have the ridiculous numbers that starting pitchers are used to being measured by. He doesn't have anywhere near 300 wins. He doesn't have the strikeout numbers. But he had a real impact on the sport of baseball. And I'm not saying that Stephen Strasburg should be a surefire Baseball Hall of Famer, but he deserves some consideration. What I am saying is the sport needs to reevaluate how they look at Hall of Fame starting pitchers, because absolutely no one in a few years is going to live up to their ridiculous statistics to even get considered to be a Baseball Hall of Famer. Johan Santana didn't make the Baseball Hall of Fame, even though he's a guy who won multiple Cy Youngs. I don't know if Seattle Mariners ace Felix Hernandez is going to get into the Baseball Hall of Fame. The last few guys who are going to be surefire Hall of Famers by the old metrics are Justin Verlander, Max Scherzer, and Clayton Kershaw. The rest, I mean, who knows? Jacob deGrom has won multiple Cy Youngs, but probably isn't going to be a Baseball Hall of Famer because he's not going to have enough wins. I just think the sport needs to rethink how they view starting pitchers and how they decide which ones are Hall of Famers and which ones aren't, because I don't think you can look at them and go, if you don't have 250 wins, you can't be a Baseball Hall of Famer. I look at Adam Wainwright. Adam Wainwright on paper might not be a Hall of Fame pitcher, but I believe Adam Wainwright is a Hall of Fame pitcher due to his impact on the sport. He's a winner. He's been with the Cardinals for so long. He's made a real impact when you look at postseason-wise. He's won a World Series. He's been on very good teams. He's been an ace of the staff. He has done everything I believe a modern starting pitcher has done. You can't ignore an entire era of starting pitching because they don't have 300 wins. And I fear for that. And I fear like a guy like Stephen Strasburg is one of the best pitchers of his era and isn't going to get any consideration whatsoever because he didn't get to 200 wins. I get it. Baseball wants to celebrate guys who have long-term successes. They want to put in the guys who have 20-year careers and are surefire Hall of Famers. But I also think there needs to be room for guys who have short windows of dominance. And I think Stephen Strasburg had a short window of dominance. But this is also coming from a guy who thinks Madison Bumgarner deserves to be in the Baseball Hall of Fame due to his impact on the San Francisco Giants winning a World Series title. I don't think you can look at the old numbers and view pitchers that way anymore. These guys aren't going to reach 300 wins. You need to find a new way to look at starting pitchers and how they make it into the Baseball Hall of Fame. I'm not saying that Stephen Strasburg should be a Hall of Famer. What I do believe is he should be considered at the very least. I mean, no one ever brings this up in the argument about who's a Hall of Famer, but it is called the Hall of Fame, and at one point, Stephen Strasburg was super famous. He was talked about in his young career, and he lived up to the hype. Like, he actually came to the sport sport and was as good as we all thought he was going to be. And that is such a rarity, especially when it comes to starting pitchers. Usually it takes a very long time for them to develop and become aces. Right off the bat, Stephen Strasburg was ready to pitch in the big leagues. And I can't stress this enough. Again, there was real hype about this player before he even pitched in the big leagues. Here's what former Padres general manager Kevin Towers told Sports Illustrated about Strasburg in 2009, quote, "He was dominating as anyone I've seen. He really has no flaws. You see guys throw in the high 90s, but they usually have no idea where it's going. He can throw it in the high 90s comfortably and locate it." The other thing I was thinking with Strasburg's possible retirement is what the Washington Nationals have done with young stars. I mean, they've really developed a lot of good ones. You have Bryce Harper, Juan Soto, Ryan Zimmerman was one of the best third basemen back in his day. I mean, there was a time where this franchise was lackluster. People were mad that they moved from Montreal. I mean, nobody cared about this organization, and they turned it around and became a World Series winner, and that never would have happened without Stephen Strasburg. Now, could you nitpick and say the Washington Nationals should have won more than they did? Absolutely. I think the team kind of underperformed based on the talent they had. I think Stephen Strasburg and Bryce Harper should have won a World Series together. I was kind of sad when Bryce Harper wasn't on that team, and then the team had to let Juan Soto go. I mean, they've had all this young talent, but they've let some of it get away, and the one guy they kept was Stephen Strasburg, and sadly, that didn't work out for them through fault of no one. In the moment when a young team comes out of nowhere, though, you just feel like they're going to win forever. You feel like Bryce Harper and Stephen Strasburg are going to come to the Washington Nationals and dominate the sport for the next 10 to 15 years. And it's always crazy when that doesn't end up happening, and nobody can ever see it coming. I remember in basketball, you have the Oklahoma City Thunder. They had James Harden, they had Kevin Durant, they had Russell Westbrook, and you just thought that that trio was going to dominate the sport. And then through circumstances, things changed drastically. With young teams, we always think the window to winning is always bigger than it really is. Even with all of the injury concerns, absolutely no one thought we would be talking about Stephen Strasburg retiring by the age of 35. Absolutely no one saw that coming. And that's why I do believe it's important to talk about it and look back at his career and think about how dominant he was for, maybe it was a short amount of time, but it doesn't mean it was for nothing. Like, I was a massive fan of this player. I thought he was going to be one of the league's best pitchers, and he did become one. I was so impressed with him winning the World Series with the Nationals in 2019. Him and Max Scherzer became dual aces for that team, and it was one of the rare few times of this decade where starting pitchers were the reason that teams won the World Series. I mean, it has become a sport that has become dominated by position players. I mean, they are the faces of the league, and now you have guys like Shohei Ohtani who are doing both things. I think we have taken for granted how prevalent starting pitchers used to be. They used to dominate the postseason, and 2019 was so refreshing to see Stephen Strasburg dominate that World Series and again live up to the hype of being one of the best pitchers in the league. And I thought after that he was going to become the absolute best in the league. I thought he was going to become a multiple Cy Young Award winner. I thought he was going to be a surefire Hall of Famer, but injuries got in the way. I haven't even mentioned this yet. He pitched for the Washington Nationals. It's not like he was pitching for the Yankees, Dodgers, Red Sox, or Cubs. Strasburg wasn't pitching for a marquee organization. He would have been even bigger if he did, but think about how big he was during that time period on the Washington Nationals, a franchise that people were excited about because of young stars. But again, this isn't a marquee franchise. This isn't a team that anyone cared about 2 years prior. Strasburg was a big name on his own without a marquee team, and I think that's something that's special when a player gets that big, bigger than the team that he's on, that he's so big that he gets you to care about the team. Yeah, it's great when the Yankees, Dodgers, and Red Sox have star players, but I think it's special when a team like Washington develops a star player because they're not used to having them. They don't take them for granted. It was a big deal that the Washington Nationals had a guy like Stephen Strasburg and another guy like Bryce Harper. That's what was so special about it, that these two guys were going to be the next faces of the sport, and they were playing on the same team, a team that no one really cared about until they were on it. Yeah, I'm sad that I'll never see Stephen Strasburg pitch again in the major leagues, but I'm also sad that I feel like I'm never going to experience that again, where guys like Strasburg and Harper come in and take over the league. Like, I just don't feel like that happens a lot. Yes, there are great young players on teams, but they're on teams that are already established. Like, what was the last time that a player became bigger than the team he's on? I mean, yes, you have guys like Julio Rodriguez, who's on the Seattle Mariners, and everyone cares about him, but he just doesn't feel as big as Strasburg did. And maybe I'm just looking back at that time fondly, but it felt big. Like, it felt like everyone was talking about it. It was on SportsCenter. It was being talked about by the national media. Maybe the sport of baseball was just more popular back then, but it was a big moment. Sports Illustrated was writing articles about how these two were the next saviors of the sport. You just don't feel that sense of importance anymore from young players. And I couldn't even tell you the last time I'd heard about somebody's college baseball career. Absolutely no one talks about a player's college baseball career. That's what we were doing with Stephen Strasburg. I want to keep saying that because it was so big in the moment. With the news of his possible retirement, everyone is talking about Strasburg's 7-year, $246 million deal. Yes, he is owed a lot of money by the Washington Nationals. This contract really didn't work out, but I don't look at it as a complete and utter failure. The guy went through injury issues, but he is one of the 5 best Washington Nationals of all time. I would put him up there with Ryan Zimmerman. I would put him up there with Bryce Harper. I would put him up there with Juan Soto. This was a good story. He is not a problem to me when it comes to the Washington Nationals. He helped put that organization on the map. I never would have paid attention to the Nationals if they did not have Stephen Strasburg on that roster. We were all super excited by his debut, and he lived up to the hype. And I think it's a sad story. This isn't a cautionary tale. This is a guy I wanted to see pitch in the big leagues 10 to 15 years. And this is also a guy who, when he pitched, it was an event. And that's something that is missing from the sport today. There aren't that many guys where you go, oh, he's on the mound tonight, I have to watch that game. Like in 1999 when you had Pedro Martinez and you had to watch that game. The sport has very few of those kind of guys. So when you see one of those guys, yes, you want to see him throw the ball forever. I also just want to state that on a human level, this is sad. I mean, this guy obviously wanted to keep pitching all of these years, but he couldn't due to health. I was a big fan of Stephen Strasburg, and I cannot imagine not being able to do the thing you want to do the most. I mean, this is a guy who was elite at what he was doing, and now he has to give that up at age 35. Part of the reason I wanted to do a podcast on this topic is because I believe we should look back at Stephen Strasburg's career fondly. We shouldn't look at him at a what could have been situation, because I think he was as good as advertised. He just wasn't able to do it for as long as we would have wanted. And yes, that is a bad thing. That is a sad thing. I wanted more from Stephen Strasburg. This is the reality of sports. There's always going to be players like this who were so good, but not for a particularly long time. Football has them way more than baseball does. I mean, they have guys like Andrew Luck, who would have been a surefire football Hall of Famer if he had played the sport for 5 more seasons. But due to injuries, he retired. That's happened. And Stephen Strasburg obviously wanted to play longer than age 35, but he hadn't pitched in forever. In the end, I will look back at Stephen Strasburg as a once-in-a-generational talent, a phenom, something you will never see again, a young pitcher who completely takes over the map, takes over the baseball world, and that's the way you should remember him also, because you're never going to see another Stephen Strasburg. Thanks for listening to this edition of Head to Head. I'm Cam McKinney, and there'll be a new episode of the podcast every Monday on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, so please rate, review, and subscribe.